The night Daniel Reyes received his eviction notice, he had $43 to his name, an early shift before dawn, and 3 days to keep the apartment he shared with his daughter. Worn down to nothing, the single father typed a message, begging his building manager for one more week to pay the rent. His exhausted thumb landed on the wrong name. Instead of his building manager, he sent it to Victoria Sterling, the CEO, the woman who had been preparing to shut down his entire department. Daniel stared at the screen as every ounce of color drained from his face. It wasn't just embarrassing. He was certain he'd just ended the only job standing between his daughter and homelessness. 3 long minutes passed. Then his phone buzzed. "Don't pay the rent yet. Come see me tomorrow morning." Alone. He read the message once, then again, then a third time, wondering if exhaustion had finally caught up with him. Because people don't expect kindness when life has spent months teaching them to expect the opposite. Daniel certainly didn't. If anything, he expected security waiting for him at work, or a termination letter already sitting on someone's desk. What he couldn't possibly know was that one desperate message sent to the wrong person by pure accident was about to uncover a truth far bigger than his unpaid rent. But none of that mattered to Daniel yet. All he knew was that his rent was overdue. His daughter, Sophie, was depending on him, and in less than 24 hours, he would be standing alone in the office of the most powerful woman he'd ever met. Let's go back to where it all started. If you've ever laid awake doing math, you already knew the answer to wondering how you'd make it through one more month. Stay with this one. It gets heavier before it gets better. Daniel was 29 when his wife walked away. Sophie was only 2. There was no shouting match worth remembering, no dramatic goodbye. Just an empty side of the closet and a note that explained nothing. For the next 5 years, Daniel took every shift he could get, convinced that if he just worked harder, if he stayed reliable, eventually life would give him a break. It never did. It only got harder. He didn't know the missing money from his paychecks wasn't a payroll mistake. He didn't know dozens of other employees were quietly losing money the same way. He didn't know the message he'd accidentally sent had landed in the one place that could finally expose it all. He only knew his rent was due. His bank account was empty. And somehow, the one person he expected to fire him on sight was the one telling him to wait. Daniel Reyes had worked in the maintenance division of Sterling Holdings for 6 years. He hadn't dreamed of building a career there. He'd simply needed a steady paycheck. When Sophie was born, steady became more important than ambition. For a while, the job gave him exactly that. He showed up early. He stayed late whenever overtime was available. He fixed broken elevators, leaking pipes, failing boilers, and anything else the company asked of him. No one ever questioned his work. Then something changed. The overtime hours he worked stopped matching the overtime hours on his paycheck. At first, Daniel assumed it was a payroll mistake. Everyone made mistakes. He mentioned it once. Payroll told him to speak with management. Management told him payroll would fix it. Nothing changed. Then came the safety reports. Every time Daniel documented a serious problem in one of the company's apartment buildings, the reports seemed to disappear before anyone acted on them. Broken fire doors, faulty wiring, heating systems held together by temporary repairs. Each time, he was told the same thing. "We'll take care of it." They never did. The man responsible for overseeing his division always had another explanation. Budget delays, administrative errors, temporary shortages. Excuses that sounded reasonable enough to stop further questions. Daniel wanted to believe them. He had to, because believing the company was making honest mistakes was easier than believing the company simply didn't care. Week after week, his paychecks grew smaller. Bills didn't. Rent didn't. Groceries certainly didn't. He picked up every extra shift he could find, convinced that one more week of hard work would finally get him caught up. Instead, he fell further behind. By the time the eviction notice appeared on his apartment door, Daniel had stopped asking when the missing money would be returned. He was too busy figuring out which bill could wait another week. What Daniel didn't know was that he wasn't the only employee asking those questions. He wasn't the only paycheck that didn't add up. And he certainly wasn't the only person whose reports kept disappearing before anyone else could read them. But none of those connections have been made yet. Not by Daniel. Not by anyone who could stop it. That would begin with one exhausted father, one late-night text, and one mistake that should never have happened. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He lay awake on the couch, his phone resting on his chest, the message lighting up the room every time he unlocked the screen. Don't pay the rent yet. Come see me tomorrow morning. Alone. He read it so many times the words stopped looking real. Sophie was asleep in the next room, completely unaware that her father's future might have changed because of one exhausted mistake. Daniel imagined every possible outcome. Maybe it was a meeting with human resources. Maybe security would already be waiting for him. Maybe this was simply the most professional way to fire someone. More than once, he thought about not going. But staying home wouldn't save his job. It wouldn't pay the rent. It wouldn't keep a roof over Sophie's head. So before sunrise, he put on the only dress shirt he owned, ironed it as best he could, and made his way to Sterling Holdings headquarters. In 6 years with the company, he had never stepped beyond the employee floors. The executive level felt like a different world. The receptionist looked up as he approached. "Mr. Reyes?" Daniel nodded. "Ms. Sterling is expecting you." His stomach tightened. A moment later, the office door opened. Victoria Sterling looked up from her desk. She wasn't smiling, but she didn't look angry either. "Please," she said calmly. "Come in." Daniel stepped inside. She gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit down." He obeyed, trying not to let his shaking hand show. For a few long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Victoria picked up her phone. "Mr. Reyes." She looked directly at him. "Was that message meant for me?" Daniel felt the heat rush into his face. "No, ma'am. It wasn't. It was supposed to go to my building manager. I'm sorry. I didn't realize what I'd done until after I'd sent it." Victoria studied him without saying a word. "You asked for more time to pay your rent. Was any part of that untrue?" Daniel swallowed. "No. My paycheck came up short again. I've been trying to catch up for months. I thought if I could just get one more week." His voice faded. Victoria remained silent. Then she asked another question. "How many times has your paycheck been short?" Daniel frowned. "I don't know. More than once. I figured it was payroll. They always said they'd fix it, but they never did." Victoria reached for a notebook. "What department?" "Maintenance." "How long have you worked here?" 6 years. "Do you have your recent pay stubs?" Daniel blinked. Yes. I keep them in my bag." He slid the folded papers across the desk. Victoria looked through them one by one. The room fell completely silent. Her expression didn't change, but she stopped turning the pages. She looked back at Daniel. "Would you mind waiting here for a few minutes?" Daniel's heart sank. Am I being fired? For the first time since he'd entered the office. Victoria answered immediately. "No." She stood, gathering the pay stubs in her hand. "I just need to verify something." Daniel watched her leave the office. He sat there alone, with no idea that those few sheets of paper were about to expose something far bigger than either of them could imagine. Victoria returned almost 20 minutes later. This time, she carried a folder thick enough that Daniel could see loose papers sticking out from the sides. She closed the office door behind her. Without saying a word, she sat back down across from him. "I compared your pay stubs with the payroll records," she said. "They don't match." Daniel wasn't surprised. "I told you they wouldn't." Victoria looked at him for a long moment. "Most people would have." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "If someone in your position wanted to take advantage of the company, this would have been the perfect opportunity. You could have claimed unpaid hours that never existed. You didn't." Daniel shook his head. "I just wanted what I earned." Victoria nodded slowly. "I believe you." For the first time that morning, Daniel felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. Not much, just enough to breathe. Victoria opened the folder. "I checked another employee." She slid one payroll record across the desk. The same discrepancy. Then another, and another. Daniel stared at the pages. "So, it isn't just me." "No, it isn't." She leaned back in her chair. "That's what worries me." The room fell quiet. Daniel finally asked the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind since he'd walked into the office. "So, Why am I here? Victoria folded her hands together. Because you're the first person who's ever brought the problem directly to me. It wasn't exactly intentional. I know. A faint smile crossed her face before disappearing again. But accidents have a way of revealing things people work very hard to hide. She picked up another document. This wasn't the only thing I found. She placed a maintenance report on the desk. Daniel recognized it immediately. I wrote that. It says the repair was completed. It wasn't. You've seen it. I was there last week. The wiring was still exposed. Victoria looked down at the report. Someone signed off on work that never happened. Daniel felt the room suddenly grow smaller. The same people handling payroll are connected to maintenance. I don't know yet. Victoria answerdanistvi. But I'm beginning to think these aren't isolated mistakes. Daniel looked back at the paperwork scattered across the desk. For months, he'd convinced himself he was unlucky. Now he wasn't so sure. Victoria closed the folder. I need more answers before I accuse anyone. Daniel nodded. So do I. She stood. For now, go back to work. Act exactly like you always have. If anyone asks about this meeting, tell them we discussed the message you sent by mistake. And that's all. Daniel rose from his chair. You think someone will notice? Victoria met his eyes. If I'm right, they already have. Daniel left the executive floor carrying nothing in his hands. But for the first time in months, he wasn't carrying the weight of his struggle alone. What neither of them realized was that someone else in the building already knew Daniel had been upstairs and was about to make sure he regretted it. 2 days passed without another meeting. Victoria kept her promise. Daniel went back to work as though nothing had happened. He fixed broken boilers. He replaced leaking pipes. He signed the same maintenance logs he always had. But something had changed. People were watching him. Conversations stopped when he walked into the break room. Supervisors who barely knew his name suddenly wanted updates on jobs they'd never cared about before. By Wednesday afternoon, the email arrived. Report to Mr. Wade's office immediately after your shift. Daniel stared at the screen. His stomach tightened. He'd worked at Sterling Holdings for 6 years. In all that time, the chief operating officer had never once asked to see him. Victoria's warning echoed in his mind. Go. Act like nothing has changed. So he did. Wade's office was everything Daniel expected. Quiet, expensive, immaculate. The kind of room where every word felt recorded even when no one was writing anything down. Mr. Reyes. Wade didn't offer a handshake. I understand you met with Ms. Sterling. Daniel nodded. Yes, sir. What did she want? My text. The one I sent by mistake. That's all. Wade held his gaze for several seconds. Then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind people where when they've already decided what they think of you. I hope you understand how important loyalty is. Edo. This company has been very good to you. Daniel almost laughed. Instead, he stayed quiet. Wade opened a file. It was Daniel's personnel record. 6 years of evaluations. Attendance. Performance reviews. Every mistake he'd ever made. You have a daughter. Daniel's heartbeat quickened. Yes, sir. I'd hate to see a good employee lose everything over a misunderstanding. The words sounded polite. The meaning wasn't. Daniel understood perfectly. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. When he walked out, he knew 2 things. First, Wade knew about his meeting with Victoria. Second, someone inside the company was watching both of them. That evening, Daniel met Victoria exactly where she'd instructed him. Not in her office. Not inside the building. Outside, where traffic drowned out quiet conversations. He told her everything. Every question. Every word. Especially the part about Sophie. Victoria listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. Finally, she spoke. People don't make threats unless they're afraid. Daniel looked at her. You think he's afraid? I think we're getting close to something. The next morning, another piece fell into place. A former maintenance employee called Victoria's office after hearing rumors that someone was finally asking questions. Then another. Then another. Every story sounded different. But every ending was the same. Missing overtime. Disappearing maintenance reports. Pressure to stay quiet. For the first time, Daniel realized he had never been fighting this battle alone. He'd simply been the first person desperate enough to accidentally bring it to the one desk that could finally do something about it. The retaliation didn't begin with a firing. It began with little things. Things no one else would notice. Daniel's schedule changed without explanation. The overtime he'd depended on for years suddenly disappeared. Repairs he'd always been trusted to handle were reassigned to newer employees. No one said he was being punished. No one had to. Every day he walked into work, he felt it. People stopped talking when he entered the room. Supervisors watched him longer than before. Questions that had never mattered suddenly required written explanations. It wasn't enough to file a complaint. It was enough to make him wonder whether Victoria had been right. Someone new. Then came to write up. According to the report, Daniel had left a maintenance call unfinished. He read the accusation twice. He remembered that apartment. The repair had been completed before he left. The tenant had even thanked him. None of that mattered. The paperwork now said otherwise. When he tried explaining it, Human Resources accepted the report without asking another question. For the first time in 6 years, Daniel had a disciplinary warning in his file. At home, things weren't much better. The rent extension Victoria had helped him secure was almost over. Bills continued arriving. Money didn't. One evening, Sophie looked up from the kitchen table. "Dad, are we moving again?" Daniel forced a smile. "No, we're staying." He hoped she couldn't hear how uncertain he sounded. That night, he sat alone in his car outside the apartment. For several minutes, he couldn't bring himself to go inside. Maybe Wade was right. Maybe keeping his head down would be easier. Maybe none of this was worth risking the only job he had. Then another thought entered his mind. The faulty wiring, the broken fire doors, the maintenance reports that kept disappearing. If he walked away, nothing would change. Someone else would pay the price. The next morning, Victoria asked to see him before work. She looked more tired than the last time. "I've spoken to more employees," she said quietly. "They're telling the same story. Missing overtime, missing reports. But no one wants to put their name on the record. They're scared. So am I." Victoria nodded. "I know." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel asked, "What happens if we can't prove it?" Victoria looked out through the office window. "Then the people responsible keep doing exactly what they've been doing." Daniel looked down at his hands. He thought about Sophie. He thought about every family living in buildings that weren't as safe as they believed. Then he looked back up. "I'm not walking away." Victoria gave a small nod. "Neither am I." Neither of them noticed the figure standing across the street, watching Daniel leave the building, before quietly making a phone call. The message from Preston Wade arrived just before lunch. "My office, 4:30, come alone." Daniel read it twice. The last time Preston had summoned him upstairs, he'd hidden a threat behind polite words. This time, Daniel knew better than to expect subtlety. At exactly 4:30, he stepped into Preston's office. Something was different. Preston smiled. Not the cold, measured expression Daniel remembered. A real smile. "Daniel." He gestured toward the chair. "Seat." There were 2 cups of coffee on the desk, one waiting for him. Daniel didn't touch it. Preston leaned back. "You know, I've been thinking about you." Daniel said nothing. 6 years with this company. Excellent record. Single father. Never caused trouble until recently. There was something almost friendly in his voice. That frightened Daniel more than the threats had. "Men like you are the backbone of companies like this," Preston continued. "You work while executives sit in meetings taking credit for it." Daniel watched him carefully. "Is that why I'm here?" Preston smiled. "Straight to business." "I respect that." He opened a drawer, then placed an envelope on the desk. Daniel looked at it but didn't reach for it. "What is that?" "An opportunity." Preston pushed it toward him. Inside was an offer letter. Daniel's eyes moved across the page. A new position, higher salary, benefits, hours that would finally let him spend evenings with Sophie. Then he saw the bonus. He stopped breathing for a second. It was enough to cover an entire year of rent. No eviction notices. No choosing between groceries and electricity. No lying awake wondering how long he could keep Sophie from realizing how close they were to losing everything. For the first time in years, Daniel could see what peace might look like. Preston watched his face. You deserve stability. Daniel looked up. What's the catch? Preston's smile didn't move. No catch. He placed another document beside the offer. Just clarity. Daniel picked it up. The first paragraph was enough. It said Victoria Sterling had pressured him into making false accusations against senior management, that she had taken advantage of his financial situation, that the payroll discrepancies and altered maintenance records he provided were either misunderstood or fabricated. Daniel slowly lowered the page. You want me to lie? I want you to correct the record. The record isn't wrong. Preston leaned forward. Be careful. The warmth disappeared from his voice. You have a daughter. Daniel's jaw tightened. Leave Sophie out of this. I'm thinking about Sophie more than you are. Preston tapped the offer letter. One signature. That's all. Tomorrow morning, you're in a better position. Your salary goes up. Your rent disappears as a problem. And your daughter gets the stability you've been working yourself half to death trying to give her. Daniel looked down at the papers again. The cruelest part was that Preston wasn't offering him something he didn't want. He was offering Daniel everything he wanted. Security, time with Sophie, a home he didn't have to fear losing. All he had to do was sell the truth. Daniel let the silence stretch. Then he did something Preston didn't expect. He didn't refuse. Not immediately. He leaned back and stared at the offer as though he were actually considering it. Because suddenly Daniel understood something. Preston wouldn't be making an offer this large, unless he was afraid. Can I have until tomorrow? Daniel asked. Preston's expression softened. Of course. Daniel stood. He left the offer on the desk. But Preston didn't seem bothered. As far as he was concerned, Daniel Reyes was already bought. He wasn't. Later that evening, Daniel told Victoria everything. The salary, the promotion, the bonus, the statement. Victoria listened quietly. Then she asked him something Daniel wasn't expecting. Why didn't you take it? Daniel looked at her. What? That money could solve your immediate problems. Your rent. Sophie's stability. You could walk away from all of this tomorrow. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he answered, because if I sell the truth this once, Sophie grows up in a home paid for by me, becoming the kind of man I hate. Victoria didn't answer. She didn't need to. For the first time, she understood that Daniel wasn't helping her because he expected her to save him. He was doing it because he believed what was happening was wrong. And while Preston believed he'd just found Daniel's price, he'd actually made his first serious mistake. Because the offer proved something neither Daniel nor Victoria had been able to prove before. Preston Wade was scared. And scared men make mistakes. The board meeting began at 9 o'clock sharp. Daniel had never been inside Sterling Holdings' boardroom before. He wasn't supposed to be there. Maintenance employees didn't attend meetings like this. Neither did single fathers wondering how they were going to pay next month's rent. Victoria stood at the head of the long conference table. Every board member was present. So was Preston Wade. He looked completely relaxed. Daniel almost admired it. If he hadn't known the truth, he would have believed Preston belonged there. Victoria broke the silence. Thank you all for coming. I've called this meeting because evidence has come to light regarding payroll practices, maintenance records, and financial approvals inside this company. Preston smiled politely. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. There is. Victoria nodded. I'd like to begin with payroll. She distributed copies around the table. No speeches. No accusations. Just documents. One board member frowned. Another adjusted his glasses. A third quietly compared two payroll reports side by side. The overtime hours don't match, someone finally said. Victoria nodded. No, they don't. Preston leaned forward. Administrative errors. They happen. Victoria said nothing. Instead, she placed maintenance reports beside the payroll records. Reports marked complete. Repairs never performed. Photos taken only days earlier. The room grew noticeably quieter. Preston's confidence began to fade. This proves nothing. Victoria looked toward the door. Mr. Reyes. Daniel stepped forward. His hands felt heavier than they ever had carrying a toolbox. Victoria looked at him. Tell them what happened. Daniel spoke quietly. He told them about the missing overtime, the disappearing maintenance reports, the accidental text. Then, he reached into his folder. I have one more thing. He placed Preston's offer letter on the table. No one touched it at first. One director finally picked it up. He read silently. Then his expression changed. He passed it to the next person, then the next. Around the table it went. The room was silent. Finally, one director looked directly at Preston. Is this your signature? Preston didn't answer. Another director spoke. Did you offer this employee a promotion and bonus in exchange for a false statement? Still, nothing. The silence was answer enough. Victoria folded her hands. I believe the board now has everything it needs. No one defended Preston. No one questioned Daniel. The evidence spoke louder than either of them ever could. Within minutes, the board voted unanimously to suspend Preston Wade pending a criminal investigation. Security entered quietly, not dramatically, professionally. One officer approached Preston. Sir, we're going to need you to come with us. For the first time, Preston looked afraid. As he was escorted from the room, he looked back once at Daniel, the maintenance worker he dismissed as insignificant, the single father he believed could be bought, the man whose accidental text had exposed everything. The boardroom door closed behind him. The room remained silent for several long seconds. Then one of the directors looked at Daniel. Mr. Reyes, thank you. Daniel didn't know what to say. He hadn't come looking for recognition. He'd only wanted enough money to pay his rent. Instead, he'd helped save a company from the people who had been quietly destroying it from within. 6 months later, Daniel Reyes unlocked the front door of a different apartment. This one wasn't borrowed. It wasn't temporary. And every time he turned the key, he knew it would still be his home tomorrow. Sophie rushed past him laughing, disappearing into a bedroom she had already decided was perfect. Dad, come look. Daniel smiled and followed her. Morning sunlight poured through the window. There was enough space for her books, her drawings, and the future he'd spent years hoping he could give her. For the first time in a very long time, he wasn't wondering how long they would be allowed to stay. Preston Wade no longer worked for Sterling Holdings. The investigation had uncovered years of payroll fraud, falsified maintenance records, and corruption that reached far beyond what anyone had imagined when one exhausted father accidentally sent a message to the wrong person. The legal process would continue for months, but the truth no longer depended on Daniel's word alone. The evidence spoke for itself. Sterling Holdings began rebuilding, not just its systems, but its reputation. Victoria kept her promise. Employees who raised concerns were finally heard. Maintenance reports were no longer ignored. People who had spent years believing their voices didn't matter finally knew someone was listening. As for Daniel, he never went back to being invisible. Victoria offered him a new role within the company, not because she felt sorry for him, because she trusted him. The company needs people who tell the truth, she told him, especially when it's difficult. Daniel accepted, not for the title, not for the office, but because he wanted to make sure no one else would ever sit where he once had, wondering why honest work was never enough. That evening, Sophie sat across from him at the kitchen table doing homework. After a few minutes, she looked up. Dad, yeah. She smiled. We're really staying here this time? Daniel looked around the apartment, then back at his daughter. Yes, sweetheart. We're staying. For a moment. Nothing else needed to be said. Months earlier, he had believed one wrong text had ruined his life. Instead, it had exposed the truth, protected families he would never meet, given his daughter a home she no longer had to fear losing, and reminded him that sometimes the smallest mistake can become the beginning of everything. If Daniel's story stayed with you, I'd love to hear from you. What's one moment in your life that felt like a disaster at first, but ended up changing everything for the better? Share your story in the comments. I read as many as I can, and it's always incredible to see how people find hope in the most unexpected moments. And if stories like this remind you that kindness, integrity, and perseverance still matter, be sure to subscribe and join our community. We share heartfelt stories like this every week, and I'd love to have you here for the next one. Until then, Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.